When you think of a royal family that lost everything, you probably picture the Romanovs, a cellar in Ekaterinburg, an entire family erased in a single night. But the largest imperial house on earth lost more than they did, and lost it later, and almost nobody in it died for it. 600 years, 3 continents, 36 sultans, and when the end finally came, the House of Osman was handed a piece of paper and given days to pack. This is why they survived when almost every other deposed dynasty didn't. Because here's the part most people never hear. The Ottomans didn't just fall, they fell twice. They were exiled, stripped of their citizenship, stripped of their property, and scattered across a dozen countries with passports that only worked in one direction out. And then decades later, when their descendants had finally rebuilt quiet lives in the places that took them in, some of those places collapsed too, and they had to run again. And still somehow the family is here. There are hundreds of them alive today. One of them was buried in Istanbul in 2009 with crowds in the streets, inside a royal tomb, in the same city his grandfather ruled from. No other fallen imperial house managed anything close to that. So how does that happen? How does a family that governed from Vienna's doorstep to the Persian Gulf end up living above a restaurant in Manhattan and still outlast every rival dynasty that fought harder, spent more, and had far better odds of keeping its crown? The answer isn't luck, and it isn't sympathy. It's a series of decisions made under enormous pressure by people who understood something almost none of their royal contemporaries understood. And the first of those decisions wasn't even made by an Ottoman. To see it, you have to start in Istanbul, in the autumn of 1922, and the city you need to picture is not the city of the postcards. The war had been over for 4 years, and the capital of the empire was still under Allied occupation. British, French, and Italian troops controlled the streets. Foreign warships sat in the Bosphorus with their guns pointed at the shoreline, and in Yildiz Palace sat Mehmed VI, the 36th Sultan of the House of Osman, a man who was technically the sovereign of an empire and practically the guest of the armies parked outside his window. Meanwhile, 600 kilometers away in Ankara, a completely different government had been running a war and winning it. Mustafa Kemal and the Grand National Assembly had fought the Turkish War of Independence and come out the other side with something the Sultan no longer had: an army, a mandate, and momentum. 2 governments now claimed to speak for the same people. That could only end one way. On the 1st of November 1922, the Assembly in Ankara abolished the Sultanate. Notice what they did not abolish. They split the Sultan's role in half and kept the second half alive: the Caliphate, the religious office, the spiritual leadership of Sunni Muslims worldwide. The political throne was gone, the sacred title was left standing. Remember that, because that gap is the first reason the family survived, and almost nobody at the time understood what it was for. For Mehmed VI, the message was obvious enough. He was no longer sultan. He was a private man in a palace surrounded by an occupation that was about to leave, in a city that was about to be handed to the people who had just deposed him. 2 weeks later, on the 17th of November 1922, he walked out of a side entrance in the rain, got into a British car, and boarded a British warship, HMS Malaya. The last sultan of the Ottoman Empire left his capital as a passenger on someone else's navy. And here's where you see the difference between a man who accepts the ending and a man who tries to argue with it, because Mehmed VI tried to argue with it. For Malta, he sailed to the Hejaz. He went to the Arabian coast, hoping that Sharif Hussein, the ruler of Mecca, would back him, that the caliphate could somehow be relocated and rebuilt from the holy cities, that the office would find him a new base. It didn't happen. Hussein had his own ambitions, and within a few years he'd lose his own kingdom to the Saudis. The last sultan got nothing out of it. So he settled in San Remo on the Italian Riviera and lived out his final years there. He died in 1926. He was 65, and this is where his story turns into a warning for everyone who came after him, because by the accounts that circulated afterwards, the deposed emperor of the Ottomans died in debt, and his burial was held up while the money was sorted out. He wasn't buried in Istanbul. He couldn't be. His body was taken to Damascus and laid to rest in the courtyard of a mosque his own ancestors had built, a Suleymaniye far from the one he grew up beside. 4 years earlier he had been sovereign of an empire. Now he was a foreign guest in a Syrian graveyard. Back in Turkey, the half-title kept walking for a little while longer. On the 18th of November 1922, the assembly elected a new caliph, not a sultan, not a head of state, just a caliph. His name was Abdülmecid II, a cousin of the departed sultan, and he is one of the most unusual figures in the entire 600-year story of the dynasty. He was a serious painter. He'd trained in oils, exhibited his work, collected butterflies, played Chopin and Beethoven, read constantly. He was, in every meaningful sense, an intellectual who had spent most of his life waiting in the wings of a system that was about to be dismantled around him. He lasted 16 months, and in those 16 months he made one mistake, not a crime, not a plot, just a mistake of visibility. He was popular, delegations came to see him, letters arrived from Muslims in India who saw the caliphate as an institution worth defending, and some of that correspondence found its way into the newspapers. Ankara watched a religious office start behaving like a rival center of gravity, and Ankara drew the obvious conclusion. On March 3, 1924, the Grand National Assembly abolished the caliphate, and in the same session they passed Law No. 431, and this is the document that decides the fate of the entire family. It didn't just remove Abdul Mesid, it expelled every single member of the House of Osman from Turkish soil. Men, women, children, infants. Their Turkish citizenship was revoked, their property was confiscated, they were forbidden from returning, and their passports were valid for departure only. Now stop for a second, because the strangest thing about that law is not what it did. It's what it deliberately didn't do. There were no arrests, no tribunals, no firing squads, no trials for treason, no confiscation of life to go with the confiscation of land. A republic that had just fought a brutal war of independence, that had every legal instrument and every political excuse it needed, chose to remove the dynasty rather than destroy it. And that choice, made by the family's own opponents, is the single largest reason the House of Osman still exists. Think about the logic of it from Ankara's side, because it's cold and it's brilliant. A dead sultan is a martyr. A dead prince is a story that gets told for a century, a face on a flag, a reason for somebody to come back with an army. A living prince in a rented apartment in Nice with no money and no citizenship is nothing. He's an anecdote. The Republic didn't need the Ottomans dead. It needed them irrelevant. Exile did that job better than execution ever could. And it did it without giving anyone a corpse to rally around. Compare that to what happened in Russia 6 years earlier. Nicholas II abdicated in 1917, and by the summer of 1918 he, his wife, and their 5 children were dead in a house in Ekaterinburg, killed because a civil war was raging, and the Bolsheviks calculated that a living imperial family was a rallying point for the armies, advancing towards them. That is the crucial difference in Russia. The dynasty still had value as a symbol, so it was eliminated. In Turkey, the dynasty was rendered valueless first and then allowed to walk. Same century, same collapse of empire, completely opposite outcomes, and the deciding factor was whether anyone still needed them, but being allowed to leave is only half the story. Plenty of royal families were allowed to leave and still fell apart within a generation. What the Ottomans did with their exile is the other half, and it starts on a railway platform. Abdülmesid II was put on a train at night, quietly out through Çatalca and towards Switzerland. Across the following days, the rest of the family went the same way. Princes, princesses, elderly women, who had lived their entire lives inside palace walls and had never bought a train ticket or handled their own money. Some were given a small sum of cash for the journey. Many carried jewelry because jewelry is what you can sell. They boarded at Sirkechi Station, the same terminus that had received the Orient Express and every foreign dignitary who ever came to pay respects to the Sultan, and they left through the door they used to greet people at. And then they scattered. That word matters more than it sounds, because scattering is a survival strategy even when nobody plans it that way. They went to France, to Egypt, to Lebanon, to Syria, to Switzerland, later to Britain, India, and the United States. There was no single Ottoman colony in exile, no court in waiting in one city where the whole house sat together drafting proclamations. There was no address you could raid. Within a decade, the dynasty had become a diaspora, and a diaspora is very hard to eliminate because there is no longer a single point of failure. They also did something quieter and far more important. They stopped making claims. Search the historical record for an Ottoman restoration movement, an army, a fund, a government in exile, a declared claimant marching on Anatolia. You will not find one that amounts to anything. No Ottoman prince raised a foreign-backed force. No Ottoman prince accepted a puppet crown from a rival power. No Ottoman prince spent the 1930s giving interviews about the throne he intended to reclaim. The head of the house was recognized within the family, the genealogy was kept, and that was the extent of it. Publicly, for decades, the answer to the question, "Do you want the throne back?" was some version of no. That silence looks like resignation. It was actually the most effective political decision the family ever made. Every dynasty that made the opposite choice paid for it, and paid quickly. Take Charles I, the last emperor of Austria-Hungary. He went into exile in Switzerland in 1919 and refused to accept it. In 1921, he tried to retake the Hungarian throne. He failed, went back to Switzerland, and then tried again 7 months later. He got as far as a train heading for Budapest, with troops rallying to him before the attempt collapsed. The Allies had had enough. They removed him to Madeira, a small island in the Atlantic, where he lived in cold, damp lodgings with very little money. He caught pneumonia and died in April 1922. He was 34 years old, 2 grabs at a lost crown, and the Habsburg line's reigning generation was gone inside 3 years. Or take Puyi, the last emperor of China. He abdicated in 1912 as a child, was allowed to remain inside the Forbidden City on a pension, and was expelled from it in 1924, the very same year Law 431 emptied the Ottoman palaces. That's the parallel you want to hold on to, because from that identical starting point the two houses chose opposite roads. Puyi took the offer. When Japan invaded Manchuria and needed a legitimate-looking face for a puppet state, he accepted the throne of Manchukuo and became an emperor again on someone else's terms. That decision defined the rest of his life. When the war ended, he was captured by Soviet troops, handed to the Chinese communists, and spent roughly a decade in a re-education facility. He was pardoned in 1959 and lived out his final years in Beijing working as a gardener, and then in a modest clerical role, an ex-emperor filing papers. He died in 1967. And there is the whole thesis in one comparison. Puyi reached for the crown and was owned by whoever handed it to him. The Ottomans refused every version of that offer, stayed poor, stayed quiet, and stayed free. The same lesson repeats everywhere you look in that era. Napoleon's heir, the Prince Imperial, spent his exile in Britain, training as a soldier, because he believed a military reputation would restore the Bonapartes to France. He was killed on a scouting patrol in southern Africa in 1879, aged 23, and Bonapartism effectively died with him. Pedro II of Brazil was deposed in 1889, refused a state pension on the way out, sailed to Europe, and died in a Paris hotel 2 years later. The pattern is remarkably consistent. In the age of empires ending, the royal houses that fought to stay royal lost the most. The one that agreed to stop being royal is the one that lasted. But surviving isn't only about what you refuse. It's also about who takes you in. And the Ottomans had one advantage no European dynasty could match. For 400 years, the family had married outward. Ottoman princesses had married into the ruling families of Egypt, into Syrian and Lebanese notable families, into Muslim royal houses much further east. The empire was gone, but the kinship network wasn't, and in 1924 that network turned into an escape route. Egypt became the single most important refuge. The Egyptian royal family had Ottoman roots of its own, and Cairo and Alexandria absorbed a significant share of the exiles, princes, princesses, and their households. Others went to Beirut and Damascus. And in one of the more extraordinary branches of the story, 2 of the last caliph's female relatives were married into the ruling family of Hyderabad in India, whose ruler was then reckoned among the wealthiest men alive. Durrashefar Sultan, Abdul Mekid's own daughter, married into that house in 1931, 7 years after leaving Istanbul with a one-way passport. She lived long enough to see the 21st century and died in London in 2006. Almost a century of history sits inside that single life. Not every branch landed softly. Selma, a great-granddaughter of Sultan Murad Vef, went from exile in Beirut to a marriage into an Indian princely family, then to Paris, where she died in 1941, at 29, in a city under German occupation, far from anyone who could help her. Her daughter grew up in France without fully knowing where she came from, and only later reconstructed the story of her own mother. That is what the exile actually looked like at ground level. Not palaces, not intrigue. Just people trying to build ordinary lives in countries that had never expected them. And then came the second fall, the one nobody in the family saw coming. The most remarkable life in this entire story probably belongs to Nesliha Sultan, and if you only remember one person from this video, make it her. She was born in Istanbul in February 1921, and she holds a distinction no one else can ever hold again. She was the last person entered into the imperial register while the empire still existed. She was also, by blood, the granddaughter of both the last sultan and the last caliph at the same time. She was 3 years old when soldiers came to the house and the family was put on trains. She grew up in exile in Europe and Egypt. In 1940, she married Prince Abdel Monaim, a member of the Egyptian royal house. And then in 1952, the Egyptian revolution overthrew King Farouk, and in the strange arrangement that followed, the infant King Fuad II was left on the throne with a regency council, and Neslisha's husband was made regent of Egypt. Stop and consider what that means. A woman born into the last days of the Ottoman Empire, exiled by law at the age of 3, found herself standing beside the acting head of state of another country, roughly 30 years later. It lasted about a year. Egypt declared itself a republic in 1953, and the second monarchy of her life vanished. A few years after that, she and her husband were arrested in Egypt on political charges and acquitted. They left. She eventually returned to Turkey, the country that had exiled her as a toddler, and she died in Istanbul in April 2012, at 91, having outlived 2 empires, 2 revolutions, and every institution that ever tried to define her. Her life is the family's entire method in miniature: absorb the blow, don't fight the state, move, rebuild, wait. Waiting turned out to be the strategy that paid, because the exile law, absolute as it looked in 1924, didn't hold forever. In 1952, Turkey amended it and allowed the female descendants of the house to return. The men waited another 22 years until 1974 before they were permitted back. 50 years, half a century, between expulsion and readmission. Most families would have dissolved into their host countries long before that. This one kept its records, kept its language in some branches, kept track of who was who, and simply outlasted the ban. And that brings us to the man who became the strange, understated symbol of the whole thing, Ertuğrul Osman. He was born in Istanbul in 1912, a grandson of Sultan Abdülhamid II. As a boy, he lived in a palace on the Bosphorus. In his early teens, he was sent to Vienna to be educated. And while he was abroad, the law was passed and his family was expelled. He simply never came home. He went on to the United States, worked in the mining business, and settled in New York City, where he lived for around 60 years in a walk-up apartment above a restaurant on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Not a mansion, not a compound with security, a rented flat up a staircase in a busy city where the neighbors had no particular reason to know that the polite older gentleman down the hall was the head of the House of Osman. In 1994, he became head of the family, which by then was a title with no state, no budget, and no subjects attached to it. And in the 1990s, he did something that ought to be in every documentary ever made about fallen dynasties. He went back to Istanbul, and he visited Dolmabahce Palace, the palace where he had lived as a child, where his family had received ambassadors as part of an ordinary public tour group. He paid attention to the guide. He didn't announce himself. He walked through his own childhood as a tourist. He was always careful about how he talked about the past. When people asked whether he wanted the throne back, he consistently steered away from it. He described himself as a businessman, said democracy was working well in Turkey, and made it very clear he was not a claimant. That is not modesty for its own sake. That is 80 years of family policy speaking through one man, and it's exactly why the door eventually opened. Because it did open, in 2004, Turkey granted him citizenship, restoring in one administrative act what Law 431 had taken from an entire family, 80 years earlier. He spent his final years partly in Istanbul, and when he died there in September 2009 at 97, the country that had expelled his house gave him a funeral. Prayers were held at Sultanahmet Mosque, crowds came out, government figures attended, and he was buried in the mausoleum of Sultan Mahmud II on Divanolu in the historic heart of the city among his own ancestors. Sit with that reversal for a moment, because it is the whole story compressed into one afternoon. In 1924, the family was told they were no longer citizens and could never return. In 2009, one of them was carried through the same streets and laid to rest inside a royal tomb with the state's blessing. No Romanov received that. No Habsburg emperor received that. Puyi's ashes were only moved to a commercial cemetery near the imperial tombs decades after his death, and even that was a private arrangement. The Ottomans got the one thing that almost never happens to a deposed dynasty. They were allowed to come home while some of them were still alive to see it. So where does that leave the family now? Scattered still, which is exactly as they've always been. Estimates put the living descendants of the House of Osman in the hundreds, spread across Turkey, Europe, the United States, and the Middle East. The headship of the house passes by seniority, which means it tends to land on very elderly men. And in recent years, it has rested with members of the family living in Damascus, in a city that has been through its own extraordinary hardship. Some descendants in Turkey have public profiles, give interviews, write, appear at cultural events, talk about their ancestors' legacy. Others are entirely private and prefer it that way. What none of them do is claim a throne. And that's the answer to the question this whole story is built on. Why did the Ottomans survive when most deposed royal houses didn't? Not because they were loved more, not because they were richer. They were stripped of nearly everything they had, and many of them lived on very little for the rest of their lives. Not because history was gentler to them either. They were exiled by law, denied a nationality for 50 years, and then, in the countries that had sheltered them, they watched a second monarchy fall out from under their feet. They survived because at every single point where the family could have chosen confrontation, it chose continuity instead. Their opponents chose exile over execution, and so there were no martyrs. The family chose dispersal over concentration, and so there was no single target. They chose silence over claims, and so there was nothing for a foreign power to sponsor or a domestic government to fear. They chose ordinary work in ordinary cities over the fantasy of restoration, and so their children grew up as engineers, business people, writers, and artists, rather than as pretenders to a throne that no longer existed. And they chose patience, decade after decade of it, until the country that expelled them was secure enough in itself to let them come back. There's a hard truth buried in that, and it applies well beyond royalty. The Ottomans lost the empire in 1922 and 1924. What they refused to lose was the family. Every other dynasty in this story tried to hold the crown, and in trying to hold it, lost the people who would have carried the name forward. Charles of Austria reached for Hungary and was dead at 34. Puyi reached for Manchukuo and spent a decade in confinement. The Bonaparte heir reached for a military reputation and never came back from Africa. The Romanovs never got the chance to reach for anything at all. The Ottomans reached for none of it, and 600 years of history walked out of Circaci Station in 1924, boarded ordinary trains, and quietly kept going. If you found this one worth your time, there's a whole series of these on the channel. What happened to the royal families of Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, Korea, and more after their empires fell? And tell me in the comments which deposed dynasty you think handled the fall best, because there's a genuine argument to be had there, and I'd be curious to see whether you agree with the Ottomans.